The words fell so casually from his lips, as if they were nothing more than a practical arrangement, yet to me they landed like a stone dropped into a still pond. "You can't live here without paying rent," he said, standing in the doorway of the kitchen with his arms folded across his chest. He was my daughter's husband, a man I had tried, for years, to see as family. And in that moment, he made it painfully clear that I was nothing more than an unwanted guest, tolerated only as long as I could pay for the space I occupied. For a moment, I thought I hadn't heard him correctly. The clatter of dishes, the hum of the refrigerator, and the laughter of my grandchildren in the living room seemed to drown out his words. I blinked, waiting for him to laugh, to shrug, to say he was joking. But he didn't. He just stared at me, his expression firm, his jaw tight, as if he had rehearsed those words and carried the satisfaction of finally saying them aloud. I felt a flush rise up my neck, the kind of heat that spreads when you've been embarrassed in public, even though no one else had heard. My daughter hadn't spoken, she was at the sink rinsing plates, her back to us. I waited for her to turn around, to defend me, to soften the harshness of what her husband had just said. But she remained quiet, her shoulders stiff, her silence louder than any word. I lowered myself slowly into the wooden chair at the edge of the table. My knees creaked, my hands shook slightly, and I folded them together in my lap so he wouldn't notice. "I didn't know I had to," I managed to say, my voice thinner than I intended. He gave a short laugh, not of humor, but of disbelief. "Well, you do. Nothing in this world is free. Not the food, not the roof, not the electricity. If you're staying here, you need to contribute." Contribute. As if I hadn't already. I thought of the countless nights I had rocked his children to sleep, the mornings I packed their lunches when my daughter was too tired, the afternoons I walked them to school so he could stay late at work. I thought of the laundry folded neatly, the meals cooked, the quiet sacrifices I had made so their household could run smoothly. But I didn't say any of that. I just sat there, feeling the sharp sting of being reduced to a burden in the very home where my laughter once mingled with the giggles of my grandchildren. I turned my eyes toward my daughter, hoping she would interject. But she only placed another plate into the dish rack, water dripping from her fingertips, and still she said nothing. Her silence was permission. Permission for him to speak to me this way, permission for me to be made small in a home I had believed was also mine. The room seemed colder after that. I excused myself quietly and walked to the small bedroom they had given me, the one at the end of the hall where I kept my suitcase tucked under the bed. Closing the door, I pressed my back against it, the weight of what had just happened sinking into my chest. I had never been told before, not in such plain words, that I was unwelcome. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay on my side, staring at the shadows on the wall, hearing the muffled sounds of the television in the living room. His words echoed in my head, over and over, until they weren't just words anymore, they were a truth that seemed undeniable. "You can't live here without paying rent." The house smelled of the family I loved, the faint sweetness of my daughter's perfume, the crayons scattered across the rug, the sound of my grandson's laughter, but suddenly, it no longer felt like mine to belong to. I thought about leaving. The idea frightened me, not because I didn't know how to live alone, but because I had convinced myself that my place was here, surrounded by them. I had built my days around my grandchildren's needs, my evenings around my daughter's stories, my mornings around the routines of this household. Where would I go if I left? And yet, what did it mean to stay when my presence was so clearly conditional, measured not by love or gratitude but by money I did not have? I remembered the envelope tucked away in the back of my drawer. Not money, no. But something else. Something I had kept for years, through every disappointment, every sacrifice. Something that was mine alone, untouched by anyone's expectations. But that thought, like a fragile flame, I kept hidden. That night, I simply pulled the blanket tighter around me and whispered to myself the truth I wasn't ready to share. Maybe it was time to stop waiting for someone else to give me a place, and start finding my own. The next morning, I rose before anyone else. The house was quiet, still wrapped in sleep, and the air was cool against my skin. I moved softly, careful not to wake the children, and found myself standing in the kitchen, staring at the same wooden table where he had spoken those words to me the night before. The light through the curtains was pale and fragile, and I felt just as fragile standing there, barefoot, holding a cup of tea that trembled slightly in my hand. I had spent most of the night tossing and turning, wondering if I had misheard him, or if perhaps he had spoken in a moment of stress and didn't really mean it. But no matter how I replayed the memory, the truth remained the same. He had said it with certainty. And worse, my daughter had not corrected him. She had not turned around, hadn't said, "She's my mother, she doesn't need to pay rent here." Instead, she had continued rinsing plates, her silence pressing down on me heavier than his words. The bitterness in my chest wasn't just about what he said, it was about what she didn't say. That silence had echoed louder than anything, telling me, in its own cruel way, that I was not her priority anymore. Perhaps she thought she was protecting her marriage, keeping the peace. Perhaps she thought I would understand. But I didn't. And the truth was, I wasn't sure I could forgive her for it. As I sipped the tea, I heard the small footsteps of my granddaughter padding into the kitchen. She rubbed her eyes with one hand and clutched her blanket with the other. When she saw me, her tired face broke into a smile. "Grandma," she whispered, climbing into my lap without hesitation. Her warmth against me, her little head resting on my shoulder, reminded me of why I had endured so much, why I had ignored small slights and swallowed words I wanted to speak. I had done it for them, for the children. I kissed the top of her hair, breathing in the scent of her shampoo. For a fleeting moment, I felt needed again, irreplaceable. But then the memory of her father's words returned, and I wondered how long even she would see me this way, how long until she, too, absorbed the message that my presence was conditional, measured by what I could give. Later that morning, when the household finally stirred awake, I busied myself with small tasks. I folded laundry, straightened the living room, and began peeling vegetables for lunch. These were things I had always done naturally, without question, but today each task felt different, heavier. For the first time, I questioned the value of my labor. Wasn't this rent enough? The meals, the clean clothes, the care for the children? But the truth was clear, none of it counted. Not in his eyes. And, it seemed, not in hers either. By midday, I found myself retreating to my room again. I closed the door and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the small suitcase under it. I thought of all the times I had packed and unpacked that suitcase throughout my life, visits to relatives, weddings, funerals. But now, the thought of packing it again filled me with both dread and a strange, unexpected thrill. Dread because I feared the loneliness of leaving. Thrill because, for the first time in years, I was imagining a life that belonged only to me. I reached into the drawer and pulled out the envelope I had thought about the night before. My fingers brushed over its worn edges. Inside were old photographs, letters, and one fragile document that had been mine for decades. It wasn't money, no. But it was a reminder that I had once been someone before I became just grandma or mother-in-law. It was proof that my life had roots of its own, separate from anyone else's. Holding that envelope steadied me. It reminded me that I had choices, even if they frightened me. That evening, when we sat down for dinner, I noticed how he avoided my eyes. He spoke to the children, to my daughter, but not to me. Perhaps he thought the matter was settled, that his words had drawn a clear line and I would fall quietly into place. My daughter served food onto his plate first, then onto the children's, and finally onto mine. It struck me then how invisible I had become in the very family I had once nurtured with my hands and heart. I chewed my food slowly, listening to the chatter around me, and I realized something important: they were already living without me. My presence was convenient, but not essential. The realization hurt deeply, but in that pain, there was also a flicker of clarity. If they could live without me, then perhaps I could live without them. Later that night, when everyone was asleep, I opened the window of my room and let the cool night air brush against my face. I thought about the small apartment I had once dreamed of after my husband passed away, a place where I could read in peace, drink tea by the window, and not feel like I was intruding. I had never pursued it, telling myself it was better to stay close to my daughter, to help her, to be useful. But maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late. The thought scared me, but it also made my heart beat faster. For the first time in years, I wasn't just thinking about surviving day to day, I was thinking about living. The days that followed were quiet, though beneath that quiet, something in me had shifted. I continued my routines, folding clothes, preparing meals, helping the children with their homework, but every task was colored by a new awareness. I was no longer doing these things simply out of love or habit, I was doing them with the recognition that they were not valued. The more I noticed it, the heavier it felt. One morning, as I poured tea into a chipped cup, I caught sight of my reflection in the window above the sink. The face that stared back at me looked older than I remembered. The fine lines had deepened, the shadows beneath my eyes seemed permanent. Yet what struck me most wasn't the aging itself, it was the weariness. I looked like someone who had spent too long trying to prove her worth in spaces that did not want her. I stared at that reflection for a long moment before whispering softly to myself, "Enough." It was a strange thing, saying it aloud. The word didn't erase my fear, but it steadied my resolve. That afternoon, when my daughter went grocery shopping and her husband was at work, I slipped on my shawl and stepped outside. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I simply walked, slowly at first, then with more purpose, down the familiar streets of their neighborhood. The air smelled faintly of smoke and rain, and the pavements were scattered with fallen leaves. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't hurrying after anyone or carrying someone else's needs on my shoulders. I was simply walking for myself. I wandered until I reached the little park at the end of the road. I had often passed it when taking my grandchildren to school, but I had never lingered. That day, I sat on a weathered bench beneath a tall tree. Children played nearby, their laughter ringing out like tiny bells. I closed my eyes and let the sound wash over me. Strangely, it didn't sting, it didn't make me long for what I thought I was losing. Instead, it reminded me of the simplicity of joy, of how life could still feel light even when burdens pressed heavily. As I sat there, an elderly man feeding pigeons glanced at me. He offered a polite nod, and I returned it. We didn't exchange words, but that brief acknowledgement felt warmer than anything I had felt in my daughter's house for weeks. It reminded me that kindness still existed outside those walls, and perhaps, if I looked, I could find a place where I was not merely tolerated but seen. The next day, I returned to the park, this time carrying a small notebook I had dug out from my drawer. It was filled with old scribbles, half-finished thoughts from years ago when I had still believed in writing letters to myself. I hadn't touched it in ages, but holding it again felt like reclaiming a forgotten part of me. I sat on that same bench and began to write, not much, just a few lines about how the breeze moved through the branches, about the quiet comfort of sitting alone without judgment. Each word steadied me, grounding me in the possibility that my voice still mattered, even if only to myself. When I returned home that evening, my daughter asked casually, "Where were you?" Her tone wasn't unkind, but it wasn't curious either, it was the sort of question asked out of habit rather than concern. "I went for a walk," I replied. She nodded, said nothing more, and turned back to the stove. The silence that followed was oddly freeing. For once, I didn't feel the need to justify myself, to explain every detail. It was my walk, my time. That small act of independence was mine to keep. Over the following weeks, I began leaving the house more often. Sometimes I went to the park, sometimes I wandered through the local market, touching fabrics I couldn't afford to buy, inhaling the scent of fresh bread from the bakery. I didn't purchase anything, but simply being among strangers who didn't see me as a burden was liberating. There was one particular afternoon I won't forget. I had walked farther than usual and stumbled upon a small bookstore tucked between two larger shops. The sign above the door was faded, and the window displayed stacks of second-hand books. Something about it drew me in. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of paper and dust, and the shelves leaned under the weight of forgotten stories. I ran my fingers along the spines until I found a book I had once loved in my youth. I opened it, and for a moment, I was transported back decades, to evenings when I read by lamplight, when I still believed life had chapters waiting for me to write. The shopkeeper, a kind woman with silver hair tied in a loose bun, noticed me lingering. "Take your time," she said gently. Her words, so simple, felt like an invitation not just to browse books but to remember who I had once been. I didn't buy the book that day. I hadn't carried enough money with me, but I promised myself I would return. And the thought of returning filled me with a quiet anticipation I hadn't felt in years. Back at the house, the tension remained. My son-in-law no longer mentioned rent, but his silence carried its own sharpness. He spoke to me only when necessary, his tone polite but cool. My daughter continued to stand somewhere between us, never addressing the hurt directly, perhaps hoping it would fade if ignored. But for me, it had become a constant presence, like a shadow that followed me from room to room. At night, when I lay in bed, I began to imagine what it might look like to truly leave. Not just to walk to the park or the bookstore, but to leave entirely. To find a place of my own, even if small and modest. The thought frightened me, yes, but it also filled me with a flicker of excitement, like standing at the edge of a vast ocean and daring to imagine stepping in. One evening, as I sat at the table, my granddaughter crawled into my lap and whispered, "Grandma, don't ever go away." Her words pierced me. I smiled and kissed her cheek, promising softly, "I'll always be with you." Yet inside, I knew that promise was no longer as simple as it once had been. Being with her didn't have to mean being in the same house. It could mean something deeper, something carried in memory, in love, in the invisible threads that bind us no matter the distance. That night, I took out the envelope again. I spread its contents across the bed, faded photographs of a younger me with dreams still shining in her eyes, a letter my late husband had written me when we were newly married, and that one document I had clung to all these years. It was a certificate, nothing extraordinary to anyone else, but to me it was proof that I had once worked, earned, stood on my own 2 feet. Proof that I had once belonged to myself. I traced the letters of my name printed on it, and I realized something. I had given so much of myself away that I had almost forgotten I had once been whole without them. The next morning, when the house was quiet, I dressed neatly, combed my hair with unusual care, and slipped the envelope into my bag. My hands trembled, not from weakness, but from the weight of what I was preparing myself to do. I wasn't leaving that day, not yet. But I was taking the first step toward it, the step of acknowledging that I could. The morning I carried the envelope in my bag, the air felt different. It wasn't that the world had changed, it was still the same street, the same sun rising over the same rooftops, but I walked with a purpose that had been missing for years. My heart beat a little faster, and though my hands trembled slightly, it wasn't from fear alone. It was from the realization that I was finally moving toward something of my own. I headed back to the small bookstore, the one I had stumbled upon weeks earlier. The silver-haired woman greeted me with a gentle smile, as if she remembered me. "Back again," she said, her voice soft but steady, the kind of voice that seemed to understand without prying. I nodded and returned her smile. Yes, I couldn't stay away. I browsed the shelves, and this time I bought the book I had once loved. It was secondhand, the pages slightly yellowed, but holding it in my hands felt like holding a piece of myself I thought I had lost. I paid for it with money I had tucked into my shawl, careful and deliberate. It wasn't just a purchase, it was a statement to myself that I still had choices. After leaving the shop, I didn't walk straight home. Instead, I found myself wandering further into the town, down streets I hadn't walked in years. That's when I saw it, a small sign in the window of an old building, the words handwritten in fading ink, "Room available. Inquire within." I stood frozen on the sidewalk, staring at those words. My first instinct was to keep walking, to tell myself I wasn't ready. But the longer I stared, the louder another voice grew inside me, "Why not?" I stepped inside. The building smelled faintly of polish and age, and the hallway creaked beneath my feet. A woman appeared from one of the rooms, wiping her hands on a cloth. She looked to be in her 50s, her expression kind but cautious. "You're here about the room?" she asked. My throat felt dry, but I nodded. Just to look, I whispered. She led me upstairs to a small room at the end of the hall. It wasn't much, a narrow bed, a dresser, a single window that overlooked the street. The wallpaper was faded, the floor worn, but the space was quiet, private. Mine, if I wanted it. I stood in the center of the room and felt something I hadn't felt in years, possibility. How much? I asked, my voice steadier now. She told me the amount, and I felt my chest tighten. It wasn't cheap, but it wasn't impossible either. Especially if I was careful. Especially if I used what I had tucked away in that envelope. I thanked her and promised I'd think about it. As I walked back home, I held the envelope tighter in my bag. For the first time, it felt less like a relic of my past and more like a key to my future. That evening, back at my daughter's house, the weight of what I had seen pressed against me. At dinner, my son-in-law spoke about bills, about the rising cost of groceries, about all the things money couldn't stretch to cover. My daughter nodded along, her eyes tired. I listened in silence, knowing that soon, very soon, I would no longer be part of this table in the same way. Later that night, after the children had gone to bed, I sat alone in my room and opened the envelope again. I spread its contents out, touching each piece as if it could guide me. The photographs, the letter, and that certificate. I thought about the woman I had been when I earned it, the strength, the pride. Somewhere along the way, I had let that version of myself become buried under years of sacrifice. But she was still here, waiting. The next morning, I returned to the building. This time, I didn't just look. I told the woman I wanted the room. Her eyes softened, and she nodded. It's yours, then. We'll make it work. I signed my name on a piece of paper that made it official. My hand trembled, but when the ink dried, I felt lighter. Terrified, yes. But also free. For the next few days, I lived with a secret. Every morning, I still packed lunches, folded laundry, and played with my grandchildren, but inside, I carried a truth that no one else in that house knew. I had a place waiting for me. A room with my name on it. At night, I began to prepare quietly. I folded my clothes carefully, stacking them in a way that would make it easy to slip into the suitcase when the time came. I hid away small things, my notebook, my shawl, the book I had bought from the shop. I didn't know how to tell my daughter, or if I even would. The thought of her disappointment, or worse, her indifference, gnawed at me. But the choice wasn't hers to make anymore. It was mine. One evening, as I tucked my granddaughter into bed, she clutched my hand tightly. "Grandma, promise you'll always be here when I wake up." The words tore at me. I kissed her forehead and whispered, "I'll always be with you." It wasn't a lie, not entirely. Love doesn't vanish just because walls do. Still, when I walked out of her room, tears blurred my vision. The day I left, I didn't make a grand announcement. I waited until the house was quiet, my daughter at work, my son-in-law busy, the children at school. I packed the suitcase with careful hands, folding each item as though it were part of a ritual. When I was done, I looked around the small bedroom one last time. The walls that had once felt like shelter now looked bare, indifferent. I placed the envelope on top of the suitcase and closed it with a soft click. Then, with my heart pounding, I walked down the hallway and out the front door. The world outside was bright, almost too bright, as if it were mocking the heaviness of what I carried inside. I hailed a cab and gave the driver the address of the building. As the car pulled away, I glanced back once. The house grew smaller in the distance, and with it, the years I had spent bending myself into silence. When I arrived at the building, the woman greeted me warmly. She helped me carry my suitcase upstairs, and when I stepped into the small room, I placed the envelope on the dresser. The room smelled faintly of dust, but to me, it smelled like freedom. That night, I sat by the window with the book I had bought from the shop. I read slowly, savoring each word, not because the story was new but because it reminded me of who I had once been. Outside, the streetlights flickered, casting long shadows across the walls. I was alone, yes, but for the first time in a long time, loneliness didn't feel like a punishment. It felt like space. Space to breathe, to think, to simply be. As I closed the book, I whispered to myself, "This is mine." And for the first time in years, the words didn't feel fragile. They felt true. The first morning in my new room was both terrifying and strangely peaceful. I woke to the sound of birds instead of children's voices, to silence instead of the hum of a household already in motion. For a long while, I lay in bed, staring at the pale ceiling, listening to the creaks of the building settling around me. There was no one waiting for me to pour tea, no one calling me into the kitchen, no one asking if I had folded the laundry. The emptiness pressed heavily at first, but beneath it, there was something else, something that felt like space. I sat up and opened the window. The air carried the smell of wet pavement from a night of rain. I stood there for a while, letting it touch my face. It felt like a baptism, as though I had been washed of something I hadn't even realized was clinging to me. After dressing, I walked down to the small kitchen the landlady allowed tenants to share. A man with graying hair was making coffee, humming softly to himself. He nodded at me, and I returned the gesture. No questions, no demands, just acknowledgement. It was more kindness than I had felt in weeks. I made a cup of tea and sat at a small table by the window. I drank slowly, savoring the warmth in my hands. For the first time in years, no one was watching me, no one was measuring my worth against what I could give. It was only me, and though the thought was frightening, it also filled me with a sense of dignity I had nearly forgotten. That day, I decided to explore. I walked back to the market, this time not just to wander but to buy a few things of my own. A small bar of soap, a loaf of bread, a tin of tea. They were simple purchases, but as I carried the bag home, I felt a spark of pride. These things were mine, chosen and paid for by me. Still, the nights were harder. That first week, I often lay awake, listening to the distant sounds of the street. In the silence, memories pressed in, my granddaughter's arms around my neck, my grandson's laughter echoing in the hall. I would close my eyes and see their faces, and sometimes the ache was so sharp I pressed a pillow to my chest just to feel something solid. Loneliness has a way of slipping under the skin, and some nights it nearly broke me. But then I would remember the kitchen table, the silence of my daughter as her husband spoke, the way I had shrunk into myself in that house. And I would remind myself that this loneliness, heavy as it was, came with freedom. And freedom, I was learning, had its own kind of comfort. On my third day in the new room, I returned to the bookstore. The silver-haired woman greeted me with the same warmth, and when I bought another book, she placed it in a paper bag and said, "You're starting a little library." Her words made me smile. A library. It sounded almost luxurious, though I only had 2 books. Still, I liked the thought of building something of my own, page by page. That evening, I read by the light of the small lamp in my room until my eyes grew heavy. And for the first time since leaving my daughter's home, I fell asleep without tears. In the days that followed, I built small rituals. Every morning, I brewed tea and wrote a few lines in my notebook. Some days it was only a sentence, about the weather, about a passing thought. Other days I wrote more, spilling memories and feelings onto the page. Writing reminded me that my voice hadn't disappeared, even if it had been ignored. I also began walking more, exploring streets I hadn't seen in years. Sometimes I sat in the park, sometimes I visited the bakery to smell the bread, sometimes I lingered at the fabric stall in the market. I didn't buy much, my money was limited, but I allowed myself to look, to imagine. And in those small acts, I felt pieces of myself return. But not everything was easy. One evening, as I sat in my room with my notebook, I heard my phone buzz. It was a message from my daughter, "Where are you?" I stared at the words for a long time. Part of me wanted to answer immediately, to explain, to reassure her. Another part of me bristled at the question. Where was I? I was where her silence had pushed me. I typed out a reply slowly, "I'm safe. I have a room of my own now." She didn't respond for hours. When she finally did, it was only one sentence: "You should have told me." I set the phone down, my hands trembling. Tears welled in my eyes, but not just from sadness. There was anger there too, quiet but steady. She had had the chance to speak for me when I needed her most. She had chosen silence. And now she wanted me to explain myself. I closed the phone and whispered into the empty room, "I already did tell you. You just didn't want to hear it." The days turned into weeks, and slowly, I began to settle into my new life. The room became less foreign. I hung my shawl over the chair, stacked my books on the dresser, placed the envelope in the top drawer. It was no longer just a room, it was mine. I also began speaking more with the other tenants. The man with graying hair introduced himself as Yusuf. He had lived there for years, a quiet presence who kept mostly to himself but always offered a nod or a kind word. The landlady, whose name I learned was Farah, sometimes left a small plate of food by the kitchen window for anyone to share. These small gestures stitched me slowly into a new kind of community, not family, but connection nonetheless. One afternoon, as I sat on the bench in the park with my book, a little girl ran past me chasing a ball. She tripped and fell, and without thinking, I stood and helped her up. Her mother hurried over, thanking me, and I smiled as the girl dusted off her knees and ran again. It was a simple moment, but as I sat back down, I realized something: I didn't need to cling to one household to feel needed. Kindness, care, love, they could exist everywhere, in small doses, if I allowed myself to see them. That evening, I wrote in my notebook, "I am not just a mother. I am not just a grandmother. I am me. And that is enough." The words looked fragile on the page, but reading them back, I felt stronger. And then, one night, as I sat with my tea, my phone buzzed again. This time, it was a picture, my granddaughter holding up a drawing. Beneath it, my daughter had written, "She says she misses you." I pressed the phone to my chest, tears slipping down my cheeks. I missed her too. More than I could ever explain. But I also knew that missing her didn't mean I had to give up myself. Love could stretch across distance. It had to. As I placed the phone down, I looked around my little room. The dresser, the bed, the books. It wasn't much, but it was mine. And for the first time in years, I whispered words that felt both heavy and light: I belong to myself now. The weeks turned into months, and my little room began to feel less like a stopgap and more like a home. At first, I told myself it was temporary, that I would return once things had softened, once my daughter reached out in a way that felt real. But the longer I stayed, the more I realized that temporary was only a word I used to keep fear at bay. What I had built here was not a pause in life, it was life itself. Each morning, I woke to my own rhythm. No hurried footsteps outside my door, no biting words thrown casually into the air, no silence that felt like judgment. Instead, there was the quiet sound of Yusuf humming as he brewed his coffee, the faint shuffle of Farah watering her plants, the muted chatter of the street below. Life carried on, and in its simple consistency, I found comfort. I filled my days with little rituals that grew into anchors. Tea at sunrise, a walk to the park by midday, time spent in the bookstore or at the market. I kept adding to my small library: 5, then 6, then 8 books stacked neatly on my dresser. Sometimes I reread them, other times I simply touched their spines, reminding myself that I had chosen them, that they were mine. Each purchase, no matter how modest, was a quiet declaration: I am still here. But the ache of separation never truly disappeared. Some evenings, when I closed my eyes, I could almost hear my granddaughter's giggle, the patter of her feet as she ran toward me. I would remember how she clutched my hand so tightly, as though she believed I could keep the world steady. Those memories made my chest ache with longing. Then there were the messages. My daughter reached out sparingly, her words careful, clipped. "The children miss you. Can you visit on Sunday? She drew this for you." Each message carried both warmth and distance. It was as if she, too, didn't know how to bridge the space between us. Part of me wanted to rush back at the first invitation, to fold myself into their world again. But another part of me, the part that had fought so hard to breathe, knew I could never return to what was before. I visited, of course. The first time, I arrived with trembling hands, unsure how I would be received. The children's faces lit up when they saw me, and they pulled me into their small arms with a force that nearly undid me. I held them close, breathing them in, feeling the warmth of belonging that only they could give. But then he walked into the room. My son-in-law. His expression was polite, but his eyes carried the same edge, the same quiet authority. We exchanged brief words, nothing more. My daughter busied herself in the kitchen, avoiding my gaze. And I realized, in that moment, that though I loved the children deeply, I could not live in that house again. It was not home for me. When I left that evening, my granddaughter clung to me. "Don't go, Grandma," she whispered. I kissed her forehead and whispered back, "I'll always be with you." The words hurt, but they were the truest I could give her. Walking back to my small room that night, the air cool against my skin, I thought about what it meant to love without possession, to give without losing yourself. I had mistaken sacrifice for love for so long. I had believed that being needed was the same as being valued. But now I understood, love could exist without chains, and sometimes the truest love was the kind that allowed both people to breathe freely. In time, my daughter's messages grew softer. She began asking how I was, not just where I was. Once, she wrote, "I didn't know how much I relied on you until you weren't here. I'm sorry if I made you feel small." I read those words again and again, tears blurring my vision. She didn't say everything I had longed to hear, but she said enough. Enough to remind me that love was still there, even if it had been buried under silence. I didn't reply immediately. I sat with the words for a day, then another. Finally, I wrote back, "I will always love you." But I needed to remember who I am too. It was the truth. A simple truth, but one I had spent my whole life avoiding. Seasons shifted. The leaves that once scattered the streets in red and gold gave way to bare branches, then to blossoms again. I marked time not by someone else's needs, but by my own quiet growth. I learned to cook small meals for myself, to enjoy them without rushing. I learned the joy of sitting with a book until the sun slipped low in the sky. I learned that solitude wasn't the same as emptiness, it could be a companion, gentle and steady. One afternoon, as I sat on the bench in the park, a thought came to me. All my life, I had been someone's daughter, someone's wife, someone's mother, someone's grandmother. But sitting there, watching the wind scatter petals across the grass, I realized something I had never dared to say before: I was also someone to myself. The recognition was quiet, almost ordinary. But it settled in me like a truth that had been waiting all along. Later that evening, I returned to my room and opened the envelope once more. I spread its contents on the bed, the photographs, the letter, the certificate. But this time, I didn't linger on what I had lost. I looked at them as pieces of a life fully lived, not as fragments of something broken. My past was still mine, but so was my present. I placed the photographs back into the envelope, but I left the certificate out. I propped it against the wall on the dresser, beside my small stack of books. It no longer felt like proof of what I once was. It felt like a reminder of what I could still be. That night, as I sipped tea by the window, the street below quiet and still, I whispered the words I had carried in my chest for months: "I am enough." And for the first time, I believed them. The next time I visited my daughter's house, the air was different. He still watched me with that same guarded expression, but I no longer felt small under it. My daughter hugged me a little longer that day, her eyes wet when she pulled away. The children wrapped around my legs, their laughter spilling into the room like light. And though I left again with the same ache in my chest, it was no longer the ache of exile. It was the ache of love stretched across distance, strong enough to endure. When I returned to my room that evening, I set down my shawl, opened my book, and smiled. I had thought freedom would feel like loneliness, but instead it felt like a gentle, steady breath. My life was smaller now, yes. But it was mine. Entirely, undeniably mine. and that was enough.